Plus, for the first time in Crash Course history, I had a legitimate chance of getting through an entire episode without butchering a single pronunciation. Unfortunately, next week we will be in France, and je parle français comme un idiot. Some intellectual historians might put the roots of the American Revolution earlier, but I'm going to start with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which
American Revolution written out
was
with
one,
causes.
expensive, and
Just in
two,
case
a
somebody
free
go
for the
back
British,
and have
including
memory of it.
British subjects living in America who now had more land and therefore more money. Right. So in 1765, the British government was like, hey, since we went into this debt to get you all this new land, we trust that you won't mind if we pass the Stamp Act, in which we place a fancy stamp on your documents, newspapers, playing cards, etc., and in return, you give us money. Well, it turns out the colonists weren't so keen on this, not so much because the tax was high, but because they had no direct representation in the parliament that had levied the tax. And plus, they were cranky about the crown keeping large numbers of British troops in the colonies even after the end of the 7 Years' War. And then the British government was like, you are inadequately grateful, and the colonists were like, shut up, we hate you. And the British government was like, as long as you live under our roof, you live by our rules, and so on. But eventually the British backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal inspired a line of commemorative teapots, thereby beginning America's storied tradition of worthless collectible ceramics. But in the end, this only emboldened the colonists when the British tried to put new taxes on the Americans in the form of the Townsend Act. These led to further protests and boycotts, and most importantly, more organization among the colonists. The protest escalated. 1770 saw the Boston Massacre, which with its sum total of 5 dead was perhaps the least massacre of all time. And in 1773, a bunch of colonists dumped about $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of British government decisions that actually would have made British tea cheaper. Oh, time for the open letter? That did not go well. An open letter to tea. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh. It's a gigantic tea bag. See what flavor it is. Bitter tyranny variety. Dear tea, like all Americans who love justice and freedom, I hate you. But I understand you're quite popular in the UK, where the East India Company would periodically go to war for you. But what fascinates me about your tea, I mean, aside from the fact that people choose to drink you when there are great American refreshments available like Mountain Dew, is that even though you're stereotypically English, you're not English. It's Chinese or Burmese or Indian, no one really knows, but it's definitely not English. You didn't even have tea until like the 1660s. Posers. Best wishes, John Green. So the Boston Tea Party led to further British crackdowns, and then mobilization of colonial militias, and then Paul Revere, and then actual war. But you can hear all about that stuff on like TV miniseries. I'm going to focus on one of the ways the colonists protested unfair taxation. Let's go to the plot. As previously noted, the English crown benefited tremendously from the import of consumer goods to the American colonies. And one of the most effective ways American colonists could protest taxation without representation was by boycotting British products. In order to enforce these boycotts, the protesters created committees of correspondence, which spread information about who was and was not observing the boycott, and these committees also could coerce non-compliers into compliance, which is to say that they were creating and enforcing policy, kind of like a government does. The Maryland Committee of Correspondence, in fact, was instrumental in setting up the first Continental Congress, which convened to coordinate a response to the fighting that started in 1775. This was back when Congresses did things, by the way. It was awesome. Anyway, the Continental Congress is most famous for drafting and improving the Declaration of Independence. No, that's the Will Smith vehicle, Independence Day. I mean the Declaration.
All right, so what are some of the reasons or the causes of the American Revolution, guys?
Taxes.
Taxes. Anything else? What was that one that goes with taxes? 3 words. Right, exactly, man. So not being represented and still having to pay. So those are, to me, the main ones in America. So just look and see if you can group anything, right? Like how we're doing with document-based questions traditionally. So as we watch the other videos, right now we're going to go to France. So we're going to start with this, causes of the French Revolution. And I'll always document 1 in this class. All right, your document 1, 2, 3, 4, now 4, 5. So what are you looking for in these documents? What's the thesis you're going to write at the end of class? Bam. Causes of the French Revolution. All right, so look through these. What do we think? 5 minutes? Hell no. 5 minutes it is. All right, so yeah, just try to pick out a couple. And if you get past your document, go over another one, so just in case, somebody needs some help, you can help out your classmates, all right? In the comic, document 2, try to notice some of the intricacies of the pictures.
Which one did we get?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2. Did I tell you all 2? No, right? Yeah, 2. Yeah. Now I want you to put your phone on the table, and then you can just take the red thing with you, and please be back within 5 minutes. I find that to be an effective way to make it a restroom break. Bring that and get it in the clock so we can still have this. My buddy at the school he teaches, he has a huge tire, like a 1960s tire cover, and he makes his kids have to walk around with that when they go to the bathroom. I don't know if I'm like that yet. Does anybody have any questions that seem pretty cut and dry? Y'all done this a lot already, right? At least 4 times, right? You've used these documents. Just remember the AP test does not understand shrugs. Yeah, absolutely. How do you get that from breaking down the word? I like to think about common. I'll get like 1% It's more common. Oh, right. So I think that's kind of the thing. Everybody pretty good, or y'all want a couple more minutes? Good? All right, so document 1. All right, so I'd write taxes on top of that, right? On document 1, taxes. Do you see anything else? You kind of nailed both of us by what he said. Taxes on the poor, right? So I think the dynamic of taking something from people who don't have anything is kind of the main one of that. What's the point of view? So was he pro-tax or anti-tax? Who's taxing America? The English. So this is probably a perspective of English. So you always want to read everything because there could be 2 very, very different perspectives based on taxes. If you have an American perspective, very anti. They even said in the video, the Boston Tea Party was caused because Britain was going to lower prices on tea. Are we pissed because gas prices are lower? No. So it sounds kind of weird that they would just go throw a pretty hefty amount of tea into the Boston Harbor because they thought it was going to get cheaper. But we have a point to prove, right? We just didn't want them to be in control. Document 2. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if he really has, I don't know if he's pro or against, to be honest with you, because he's just pointing out the poor. He's not really feeling bad for them, but he's not really saying we should help them either. So this is kind of, I would say, historically accurate because it doesn't really have an opinion. It's just stating the facts, which is what we talked about earlier in class also. All right, what about number 2? Man, I got so much more eye contact in first period. Are y'all tired because it's the end of the day?
Yeah.
Okay. The Steelers. What do you get out of number 2? Do you notice anything funny about the pictures?
How you dress?
I definitely think it's funny how they dress, but let's try to do something that could have been a cause. Do you think it's weird that the clergy and the nobility are not facing each other? Do you think whoever made this graphic was using that to prove a point without using any words? What do you think that point would be? Are y'all familiar with current politics at all? Do you know what happened in Congress? I want to say, a few months ago, 5, 6 months ago, when they shut down completely. Y'all know about that, right? Why'd they shut down?
We weren't agreeing.
Because they were Republicans. And what's the president? So if they shut down, can he do anything to change policy? Were the American people, whatever, if you're Republican or Democrat, were they happy about that? So if you think that the two leaders of your country aren't communicating well, what do you think these people who are working, how do they feel about that? All they can agree on is taxing, right? So what do you think this points out when you're looking at the numbers, right? 1% of people own 10% of the land. Do we hear 1% currently in America? Yeah, that's the rich. Yeah, the rich are the 1% and everybody else is everything else, right? So here, it's not as cut and dry as America is, right? But 2% of the people own 35% of the land. So add those up together, right? You're talking about 3% owning half, almost. Is that fair? Is it fair for the dude bent over a hoe, cleaning his field? Right? That might have been the wrong way to say that. But yeah, right? So what do you think the main point here is? In India, they had the caste system. What was that?
The system that you're putting whenever you were born, like you were untouchable or...
So what system is that? Social history. Somebody said it. I heard it. Class.
Okay.
So social classes, right? So for 2, we could say arguably it's discussing social classes, right? There's the clergy, there's the government, and then there's the citizens. And the citizens are smaller. I think that's indicative of being less important in the eyes of the government and the clergy. And there's way more of them. So what was a major thing in non-economic that was traded on the Silk Road? Disease was one. That's true. What's another thing? Religion, or broader ideas, right? They're spreading ideas. So when you have this many people, these two aren't communicating. Do you think they're spreading ideas at the local mill, on the farm, at church? Are they talking amongst each other? And are they talking good about these people, or are they talking bad? Right. So you're gonna mobilize, and that's what we see a lot of in the American Revolution, right? George Washington, Paul Revere, John Adams. On a lesser point, one of the cooler guys, James Otis Jr., got beat to an inch of his life because he was talking crap, like at a coffee shop. And the guy just took a cane out and just beat him down ruthlessly. James Otis Jr., cool historical figure to read about. All right, so for document 1, we said taxes. Is poor in document 1 a social class? Right? Economic class, social class loosely, so there's a little bit of a loose pairing there. All right, document 3. Did we talk about taxes already? So you've got a grouping, right, between 1 and 3. Is there anything else? A little bit, right? Because it says be born equally by all the classes, right? So then we want to look at point of view and say who's saying that, right? And that's a list of grievances. So that's somebody saying this is what's wrong with this system. We're just taxing the poor. Why don't we tax everybody equally? All right, document 4. We just went over, right? Yeah, document 4.
They're trying to copy the Americans.
My bad. Go ahead.
They're trying to copy the Americans.
If that's a cause,
Yeah, they wanted independence, like the Americans, they got their independence.
all right, so that's valid. For me, that's the idea of hope, right? If you're hopeful, you see the revolution as changing things and changing your status. But I see class, right? Because we're talking about the condition of France, which in the French Revolution, that has to do with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, Tale of Two Cities. I mean, in France, that was probably the most violent the poorer class got against the rich. Yeah, of course. Nobody asked me to use the restroom. The rule is one person per time. You need to leave your phone on your desk, please. You put your phone on your desk, you take the pass, and you go to the restroom. Okay?
What about phone?
I'm going to trust that you don't have a phone. You know, if you don't have a phone, I don't expect you to. Right? You're all good. Don't worry. I just don't want it to be something that takes away from your education because sometimes it's hard to set it down. Right? All right, so I said hope, but you can still see some social class there. But yeah, I mean, really, when you're looking at it, English historian, they're going through a revolution, right? So it really is just close to the cup. That's why I kind of see the hope as being an aspect, because if you can hope that things will change. That was one of Obama's big things, right? Hope on the stickers. It's still very poignant today. When y'all hear that community college will be free, right, if they get that passed, does that affect you? Does it make you hopeful that you won't be sitting on $40,000 in debt after 2 years of college?
Yeah.
Right? That's a car and a down payment for a house that he's trying to save for you to make your lives better. It's a pretty big deal, man. That's why. But that's, listen. I went to, it's just community college, but I went to major community. Just on a side note, I went to major college. I wasn't ready for it. I failed out of A&M. I wasted 25 grand of my parents' money. Why not go to community college, get a job, save some loot? When you do good, you get a scholarship to anywhere you want to go. Right? You have an A average. One kid said she wanted to go to Vanderbilt and be a doctor. Why waste the 40 grand? Save the money at community college. Those are called beat-out classes in college. You know, you're in with 200 kids. The professor doesn't know who you are. When you get to your junior and senior level classes, there's 20 kids. They know you by name. It's a lot harder to fail someone you know by name, right? So yeah, I mean, just consider that. It's very smart. Now, if your parents have the cash to spend, whatever. You know, do what you want to. All right, 5.
Did they talk about class?
Yeah, middle class, right? The first. Right, so would that be the hope aspect again?
Just like the fourth one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay. So guys, that's what you see with the French Revolution, right? We're still talking about rich versus poor, like in the American Revolution, right? Maybe not so much on the, I mean, we have taxes still, but it's levied from their government, it's not levied from across the ocean, so there is not as much taxation without representation. But that's that stuff, all right? So that's France. All right, now we're going to watch the Haitian Revolution. So do we already see some similarities between America and France?
Yeah.
All right, so that might be the two you want to pick for your thesis because they're pretty cut and dry and you see some similarities and you see some differences, right? All right.
You know Mr. Spears' password?
Should we?
Share with us.
Do you think that would be fair to Mr. Sear?
Yeah.
But if we
That
give them
sounds
our,
like Eddie. That Eddie saying that?
I'll tell you what, you give me your credit card number to your bank card, I'll give you Mr. Sears, you give me all the stats so I can break into your bank card, your personal information.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's probably like 30 bucks in there, right? All right, so we're going to do 4 minutes of the Haitian, And then, like I said, we'll watch the whole Latin American. So again, guys, take some notes. When you see causes, try to find the ones we've already found so you can use that to
Today we are going to discuss the oft-neglected Haitian revolutions. The Haitian revolutions are totally fascinating, and they involve two of my very favorite things. One, ending slavery, and two, Napoleon getting his feelings hurt. I can't help myself, Napoleon. I like to see you suffer. So the French colony in Saint Domingue began in the 17th century as a pirate outpost. And its original French inhabitants made their living selling leather and a kind of smoked beef called boucan. All that beef actually came from cattle left behind by the Spanish, who were the first Europeans to settle the island. But anyway, after 1640, the boucan sellers started to run low on beef. And they were like, you know what would pay better than selling beef jerky? Robbing Spanish galleons, which, as you'll recall, were loaded with silver mined from South America. So by the middle of the 17th century, the French had convinced many of those buccaneering captains to give up their pirating and settle on the island. Many of them invested some of their pirate treasure in sugar plantations, which by 1700 were thriving at both producing sugar and working people to death. And soon, this island was the most valuable colony in the West Indies and possibly in the world. It produced 40% of Europe's sugar, 60% of its coffee, and it was home to more slaves than any place except Brazil. And as you'll recall from our discussion of Atlantic slavery, being a slave in a sugar production colony was exceptionally brutal. In fact, by the late 18th century, more slaves were imported to Saint Domingue every year, more than 40,000, than the entire white population of the island. By the 19th century, slaves made up about 90% of the population, and most of those slaves were African-born because the brutal living and working conditions prevented natural population growth. Like, remember Albert Crosby's fantastic line, "It is crudely true that if man's caloric intake is sufficient, he will somehow stagger to maturity and he will reproduce?" Yeah, well, not in 18th century Haiti, thanks to yellow fever and smallpox and just miserable working conditions. So most of these plantations were pretty large. They often had more than 200 slaves, and many of the field workers, in some cases the majority, were women. Colonial society in Saint Domingue was divided into 4 groups, which had important consequences for the revolution. At the top were the big white planters who owned the plantations and all the slaves. Often these Grands Blancs were absentee landlords who would just rather stay in France and let their agents do, the actual brutality. Below them were the wealthy free people of color. Most of the French who came to the island were, men, and they frequently fathered children with slave men. These fathers would often free their children. Wasn't that generous of them? So by 1789, there were 24,800 free people of color, along with about 30,000 white people in the colony. The free people of color contributed a lot to the island's stability. They served in the militia and in the local constabulary, and many of the wealthier ones eventually owned plantations and slaves of their own. And then below them on the social ladder were the poor whites, or the petite blancs, who worked as artisans and laborers. And at the bottom were the slaves, who made up the overwhelming majority. I know what you're thinking. This is a recipe for permanent social stability. No, it wasn't. Okay, so when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, all these groups had something to complain about. The slaves obviously disliked being slaves. The free people of color were still subject to legal discrimination no matter how wealthy they became. And the poor whites, in addition to being poor, were resentful of all the privileges held by the wealthy people of color. And the Grands Blancs were complaining about French trade laws and the government's attempts to slightly improve the living and working conditions of slaves. Basically, they were saying that the government shouldn't be in the business of regulating business. So everyone was unhappy, but the slaves were by far the worst off. Mr. Green, you're always saying how much slavery sucks, but is it really any worse than having to work for, subsistence? Yeah, I'm gonna stop you right there, from the past, before you further embarrass yourself. You often hear from people attempting to comprehend the horrors of slavery that slavery couldn't have been all that bad, and that it wasn't that different from working for minimum wage. And that we know this because if it had been so bad, slaves would have just revolted, which they never did. Yeah, well, one, equating slavery to poor working conditions ignores the fact that if you work at Foxconn doesn't get to sell your children to other corporations. And two, as you're about to see, slaves did revolt. So the unrest in what became Haiti started in 1789 when some slaves heard a rumor that the King of France had freed them. Even though it was across the ocean, word of the changes in France reached the people of Haiti, where the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, while terrifying to planters, gave hope both to free people of color and to slaves. At the same time, some petite blancs argued that there was inadequate discrimination against blacks. They identified with the Third Estate in France, and they called for interest rates to be lowered so they could more easily pay their debts, and they began lobbying for colonial independence. The psychology here shows you the extent to which slaves were not considered people. I mean, these radical petite blancs thought that they were the oppressed people in Saint Domingue because they couldn't couldn't afford to own slaves. And they thought if they could become independent from France, they could take power from the people of privilege and institute a democracy where everyone had a voice, except for the 95% of people who weren't white. Then in 1791, these radical Petit Blancs seized the city of Port-au-Prince. You'll remember that by 1791, France was at war with most of Europe. And just like with the 7 Years' War, the wars of revolutionary France played out in the colonies as well as at home. So the French government sent troops to Saint-Domingue. Meanwhile, urges toward liberty, fraternity, and equality were only growing in France, and it didn't seem very equitable to grant citizenship based solely on race. So in May of 1791, the National Assembly gave full French citizenship to all free men of color. I mean, if they owned property and had enough money and weren't the children of slaves. The Petit Blancs weren't thrilled about this, and that led to fighting breaking out.
All right, did y'all see when he popped up the French Revolution sign on the screen? What similarity did he discuss there? Social class, for sure. All right, did y'all see any similarities between Haitian and the American Revolution? I would say Civil War has more to do with slaves than the American Revolution. We're trying to get away from Britain in regards to the American Revolution. How about that Declaration of the Rights of Men? Do we have a declaration of some sort in America? Right. So I mean, I think that's probably something that was taken, that was seen from us, that was used.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today I think it's going to get a little bit confusing.
We're going to talk about a few countries and a few people you might write down.
Latin America.
Which
It's a bit
country?
confusing because one,
Some of the
Latin
stuff.
America is big. Two,
I'd probably
it's
stay away
very
from Latin
diverse.
America in
Three,
regards to my
Napoleon
thesis
makes
because
everything
it's way bigger than
complicated.
the other
And
ones.
four, as we've seen in the past, sometimes revolutions turn out not to be that revolutionary. Witness, for instance, the New England Revolution, who instead of like trying to form new and better governments, are always just kicking balls around like all the other soccer teams.
One second.
Like, so before independence, Latin American society was characterized by three institutions that exercised control over the population. The first was the Spanish crown, or if you were Brazilian, the Portuguese crown. So as far as Spain was concerned, the job of the colonies was to produce revenue in the form of a 40% tax on everything that was called the royal fifth. So government administration was pervasive and relatively efficient because it had to be in order to collect its royal fifth. Then there was the Catholic Church. Even more than royal officials, the church exercised influence over people's everyday lives. I mean, the church even controlled time. The church bells told out the hours, and they mandated a 7-day work week so that people could go to church on Sunday. And finally, there was patriarchy. In Latin America, like much of the world, husbands had complete control over their wives, and any extra or premarital scoodly pooping was severely punished. I mean, when it was the women doing the illicit scoodly pooping, men could basically get up to whatever. This was mainly about property rights because illegitimate children could inherit their father's property, but it was constructed to be about, purity. To get a sense of how patriarchy shaped Latin American lives, take a gander at Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, whose name I'm actually abbreviating. A child prodigy who spoke 5 languages by the age of 16, de la Cruz wanted to disguise herself as a boy so she could attend university, but she was forbidden to do so. Still, she wrote plays and poetry, she studied math and natural science, and for being one of the leading minds of the 17th century, she was widely attacked and eventually forced to abandon her work and sell all 4,000 of her books. That's a shame, because she had a great mind, once writing that Aristotle would have written more if he'd done any cooking. A couple other things. First, Latin America led the world in transculturation, or cultural blending. A new and distinct Latin American culture emerged mixing 1, whites from Spain called Peninsulares, 2, whites born in the Americas called Creoles, 3, Native Americans, and 4, African slaves. This blending of cultures may be most obvious when looking at Native American and African influences on Christianity. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for instance, was still called Tenochtitlan, the indigenous earth goddess, by Indians, and the profusion of blood in Mexican iconography recalls the Aztec use of blood in ritual. The transculturation pervaded Latin American life, from food to secular music to fashion. Somewhat related, Latin America had a great deal of racial diversity and a rigid social hierarchy to match. There were 4 basic racial categories: white, black, mestizo, a mix of white and American Indian, and mulatto, a mix of white and black. We try not to use that word anymore because it's offensive, but that's the word they use. And from the 16th century on, Latin America had a huge diversity of mixed-race people, and there were constant attempts to classify them and divide them into castes. States. You can see some of these in so-called Casca paintings, which attempted to establish in a very weird and enlightenment-y way all the possible racial combinations. Of course, that's not how race works, as evidenced by the fact that successful people of lower racial castes could become legally white by being granted gracias al sacar. So by 1800, on the eve of Latin America's independence movements, roughly a quarter of people were mixed race. All right, now let's have some revolutions. How should we organize this, Stan? Let's begin with Latin America's most successful country as defined by quality of soccer teams. So Brazil, he said as thousands of Argentines booed him, is obviously different because it was ruled not by Spain, but by Portugal. But like a lot of revolutions in Latin America, it was fairly conservative. The Creoles wanted to maintain their privilege while also achieving independence from the Peninsulares, and also like a lot of Latin American revolutions, it featured Napoleon. Freaking Napoleon, you're everywhere. He's behind you, isn't he? Yeah. So when Napoleon took over Portugal in 1807, the entire Portuguese royal family and their royal court decamped to Brazil. And it turned out they loved Brazil. King João loved Brazil so much. Off topic, but do you think that João named herself after King João? I mean, does she have that kind of historical sensibility? I think she does. So King João's life in Rio was so good that even after Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, he just kind of stayed in Brazil. And then by 1820, the Portuguese in Portugal were like, hey, maybe you should come back and govern us, King of Portugal. So in 1821, he reluctantly returned to Lisbon, leaving his son, Prince Pedro, behind. Meanwhile, Brazilian Creoles were organizing themselves around the idea that they were culturally different from Portugal, and they had actually formed a Brazilian party. Stan, not that kind of party, come on. Yes, that kind. A Brazilian party to lobby for independence. Then in 1822, they convinced Prince Pedro of boring old Portugal that he should just become King Pedro of sexy big Brazil. So Pedro declared Brazil an independent constitutional monarchy with himself as king. As a result, Brazil achieved independence without much bloodshed and managed to hold on to that social hierarchy with the plantation owners on top. And that explains why Brazil was the last New World country to abolish slavery, not fully abandoning it until 1888. Right, so even when Napoleon wasn't forcing Portuguese royals into an awesome exile, he was still messing with Latin America. Let's go to the thought bubble. So Latin America's independence movements began not with Brazil, but in Mexico, when Napoleon put his brother on the Spanish throne in 1808. Napoleon wanted to institute the liberal principles of the French Revolution, which angered the ruling elite of the Peninsulares in what was then called New Spain. They were aristocrats. They just wanted to go back to some good old-fashioned divine right monarchy with a strong church. So the Mexican Creoles, seeking to expand their own power at the expense of the Peninsular elite, saw an opportunity here. They affirmed their loyalty to the new king, who was French even though he was the king of Spain. I told you this was complicated. Then a massive peasant uprising began, led by a renegade priest, Padre Hidalgo, and supported by the Creoles because it was aimed at the Peninsulares, even though they weren't actually the ones who supported Spain. This was further complicated by the fact that to the mestizo peasants led by Hidalgo, Creoles and Peninsulares looked and acted basically identical. They were both white and imperious, so the peasants often attacked the Creoles, who were technically on their side in trying to overthrow the ruling Peninsulares. Even though it had tens of thousands of supporters, this first peasant uprising petered out. But a second peasant revolt, led by another priest, Father Morelos, was much more revolutionary. In 1813, he declared independence, and the revolt lasted until his death in 1815. But since he was a mestizo, he didn't gain much Creole support, so revolutionary fervor in Mexico began to fade until 1820, when Spain, which was now under the rule of a Spanish rather than a French king, had a real liberal revolution with a new constitution that limited the power of the church. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So in the wake of Spain's liberalizing movements, the Mexican elites who had previously supported Spain switched sides and made common cause with the Creoles in the hopes that they could somehow hold on to their privileges. And pushing for independence together, things went very well. The Creole general Iturbide and the rebel mestizo commander Guerrero joined forces and won independence, with most of the Peninsulares returning to Spain. Iturbide, the whiter of the two generals, became king of Mexico in 1822. Remember, this was a revolution essentially against representative government, but that didn't work out, and within a year he was overthrown by the military and a republic was declared. Popular sovereignty was sort of victorious, but without much benefit to the peasants who actually made independence possible. This alliance between conservative landowning elites and the army, especially in the face of calls for land reform or economic justice, would happen over and over again in Latin America for the next century and a half. But before we come to any conclusions, let's discuss one last revolution. So Venezuela had a cadre of well-trained Creole revolutionaries who by 1811 formed a revolutionary junta that seized power in Caracas and formed a republic. But the interior of Venezuela was home to mixed-race cowboys called llaneros who supported the king. They kept the Caracas revolutionaries from extending their power inland, and that is where Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, enters the picture. Bolívar realized that the only way to overcome the various class divisions, like the one between the Caracas Creoles and the llaneros, was to appeal to a common sense of South Americanness. I mean, after all, the one thing that almost all South Americans have in common, they were born in South America, not Spain. So then, partly through shows of toughness that included like crossing flooded plains and eating without sleep, Bolívar convinced the llaneros to give up fighting for Spain and start fighting against them. He quickly captured the vice-regal capital at Bogota, and by 1822, his forces had taken Caracas and Quito. Hold on. Let's not be attacked by Argentines who are already upset about what I said about their really good soccer team. I want to make one thing clear. Argentina's General José de San Martin was also vital to the defeat of the Spanish. He led expeditions against the Spanish in Chile and also a really important one in Lima. And then in December of 1824, at the Battle of Ayacucho, the last Spanish viceroy was finally captured and all of Latin America was free from Spain. Oh, it's time for the open letter? That's a chair stand, but it's not the chair. An open letter to Simón Bolívar. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, llanero. I wonder if his hips swivel when I wind him up. Context is everything. They do. Hey there, cowboy. Dear Simón Bolívar, first you had fantastic mutton chops. It's as if you're some kind of handsome Martin Van Buren. You were a man of immense accomplishments, but those accomplishments have been richly rewarded. I mean, you have a country named after you. Not to mention 2 different currencies. But for my purposes, the most important thing you ever did was die. You may not know this, Simón Bolívar, but when I am not a world history teacher sitting next to a fake fireplace, I am a novelist. And your last words, damn it, how will I ever get out of this labyrinth, feature prominently in my first novel, Looking for Alaska, except it turns out those weren't your last words. Your last words were probably, Jose, bring the luggage. And I decided to use your fancy, romantic, inaccurate last words. It's called artistic license. Put that in your luggage. Anyway, fantastic life. I just wish you'd nailed it a little bit better with your last words. Best wishes, John Reed. So by 1825, almost the entire Western Hemisphere, with a few exceptions in the Caribbean, was free from European rule. Oh, right, and Canada. I'm just kidding, Canadians. It's so easy to make fun of you because you're so nice. And so I tease you, and then you're like, oh, thanks for noticing that we exist. It's my pleasure. Anyway, this is pretty remarkable, especially when you consider that most of this territory had been under Spanish or Portuguese control for almost 300 years. The most revolutionary thing about these independence movements were that they enshrined the idea of so-called popular sovereignty in the New World. Never again would Latin America be under the permanent control of a European power, and the relatively quick division of Latin America into individual states, despite Bolívar's pan-South American dream, showed how quickly the people in these regions developed a sense of themselves as nations.
All right, guys, last
distinct
15
from
minutes of class. Pardon me, ladies and gentlemen. Last 15 minutes of class, why don't y'all power up? Go onto the hub, find the PowerPoints for revolutionary causes, download them to your computer, put them into a folder on your desktop so that when you need to use them at home to study, you don't need internet access. Yeah, man, I would keep the 2 packets you had because you're still going to write your thesis, but you can use those PowerPoints once you open them up to help you with the thesis. And then I want you to just bring the thesis back on is it Friday this week for y'all?
Yeah.
Yeah, so bring it back on Friday and then turn them into Mr. Sear at the beginning of class. Does everybody, when I tell you to say something on the control panel, everybody knows what I'm talking about? Okay. You want to go onto the hub. Just go to that HS, your HS.
It's on your favorite show. Daily Report or favorite?
Does anybody want to teach so they can learn better how to get to the hub? You're already there? Oh, you're there now? Okay, cancel that. Are y'all enjoying the computers? Do you? I think I would, I don't know, man. I use my computer primarily for school. It's good for paying bills. It makes it so much more convenient. You want to go to Mr. Sears' class, right? To world history, once you get to the hub? Press Control-Alt-Delete. That'll get you in there. I thought you might have some sort of app on your phone that would turn your computer on for you. All right, y'all can all find Mr. Sears' class? Cool. And then there'll be a PowerPoint slideshow called Revolution's Causes. You want to go to Save As, on your file, and save it to your desktop. So today or tomorrow when you're working on your thesis, if you don't have internet connection, you can utilize that. Causes of number 7, Causes of Revolution. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you want to get ahead, y'all are going to do effects and you're going to do, all of it. But this way, at least today or tomorrow. And then if you want to work with a classmate on your thesis, just discussing similarities and differences, feel free. Like I said, man, Latin America is kind of confusing. I don't know if I would pick that one because there's so much going on. France and America is pretty easy. Number 7, Causes of Revolution. Yeah, it's tomato. Either one. Yeah. No worries. Guys, try to at least get a couple sentences in the next 10 minutes. And just make sure that by 12:55 y'all are organized and ready to rock and roll so y'all can go enjoy the rest of your day.
Did you go to 6 here?
What?